Whit Stillman is something of a cult film director. He rose to prominence in 1990 with his debut film Metropolitan, which became the first in the so-called doomed bourgeois in love trilogy. Barcelona came out in 1994 and The Last Days of Disco in 1998. Set among America's so-called preppy class, the films are delightful comedies of manners in the tradition of Jane Austen, whose lesser-known novel Lady Susan would eventually also be adapted by Whit Stillman in the film Love and Friendship, which was his last film made just over a decade ago, although I know there may be more films in the works. The films are having something of a revival, and Stillman joins me today at the end of a tour of the UK, the inevitable culmination of which is, of course, an appearance on the New Statesman podcast. What are your impressions of the UK? I mean, was it your first time in places like Sheffield, Newcastle?
Sheffield and Newcastle were first-time visits. I'd shown films before frequently in Manchester and Edinburgh and Oxford. So those are the 5 cities we visited. And I was immensely impressed with Newcastle as being a beautiful city. I think it really is helpful when a city becomes rich at a great moment of architecture and design. And I think that happened to Newcastle.
That's certainly true. Would you say there's a certain English sensibility that permeates your films? I mean, are you an Anglophile or even a Europhile?
I'm not really an Anglophile or a Europhile, but it has been true that there's been a very good reception to the films here. So the screenings have been really especially fun, and some of the best screenings I've had have been in Oxford.
Really? And do you sense a resurgence in popularity that's happening now among perhaps a newer generation?
Well, I think almost the reverse. I think we've been out of distribution and not being shown on television. So I think things have actually waned quite far down. And it's been great, this partnership with a wonderful fellow named Jeff Badger from Lost Reels UK, who's reviving a lot of films that are available on 35 millimeter. His devotion is particularly to showing films in 35 millimeter. And I lucked into being included in his programs. So we did a screening of Disco the first weekend in January at the ICA, and the ICA added screenings of Metropolitan in Barcelona. And that's what inspired this July tour.
And who's coming to these screenings?
Well, I think it's true in the United States too. The exhibitors say that post-pandemic, there's a much younger audience that's coming. So we get both people who saw the films back in the 90s and people who are discovering them now. And
this is interesting to me because all of your films, or certainly most of them, are about being young.
Yes.
And with the exception of one film, I think, all of your screenplays are set among students or recent graduates, barely out of college, normally Harvard. I mean, what is it about that period of youth that so appeals to you?
We also have Princeton graduates or Princeton undergraduates in our films. So it's a bit, it's sort of wide-ranging. Well, young people look a lot better. That's one thing. And also, it's a crossroads period. And so I think the films are comedies of identity, and it's a particularly rich period of forming your identity, I think, between 16 and 32. And so I love see these crossroads stories. And I think older people enjoy watching it as well as younger people.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you kept making films about being young even as you got older, and
yes.
You returned to this period of youth, and basically, in a sense, never really left that phase of of life in terms of your imagination. Do you still keep up with aspects of youth culture? Does this remain an interest of yours?
No.
You wouldn't be willing to turn your lens on Gen Z?
I mean, I think there's certain eternal groups, and I'm interested in those eternal groups, and I'm not interested just in characteristics of a new particular generation or something like that, because I think some groups try to sort of maintain their interests and their traditions, and that's the group I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think regardless of what you may or may not have observed about your screenings, I think it's definitely true that there is something of a revival happening among the younger generation in relation to your films? I mean, some of your films have become kind of low-key cult icons. They feature in memes and on TikTok. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I'm hopeful that that'll keep me in the business because, there are a lot of barriers to making new films, and anything that happens that can help you make new films in the future is something that encourages you. I'm a little skeptical about how deep that revival is, or, the essential fact of cult is not that many people know about it. And so, curious things happen. So the first film, Metropolitan, used to be very frequently on Film 4 of the BBC. And that really helps keeping the films alive. I think Last Days of Disco was discovered on television by a lot of people.
Yeah, by myself including.
Yeah. And so we were lucky for a period that those two films, Barcelona and Last Days of Disco, were being distributed by studios that had package deals with television companies, and so people got to see them. But I had a very good deal with this American company, Criterion, and it's been wonderful in the States where they have their Criterion channel, and in a relationship with streaming on Max. But they also took the English-speaking rights in other countries, and I think that's so they can sell the Metropolitan DVD in the UK, but they have no real foreign sales operation for television. So during the period of this Criterion contract, we've had no showings on TV in the UK. And so the efforts of Jeff Badger and Lost Reels UK has been really welcome because the film just hasn't been really watchable in the UK unless someone wants to buy the expensive Criterion DVD.
Yeah, but there's also a scene in which clips from your films are being viewed over and over on social media, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are certain clips that have become quite famous.
Well, there is this sort of Jane Austen, Lionel Trilling scene that gets referenced quite a bit because it's a phenomenon that keeps on going, so it keeps getting pulled up. And then there's this subtext scene of Barcelona, which when Warner Brothers recut the film to show on commercial TV, allowing for advertising breaks, they cut out the subtext joke. And I actually approved that because I found it improved the tension of that whole sequence much better not having the joke. One of the problems with sort of having tension and plot and suspense in a film that's also a comedy is the comedy tends to undercut and diffuse the tension you're trying to build up.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking about youth. So let me ask you, I mean, what was your own childhood and youth like? Famously, the characters in Metropolitan invent the term urban haute bourgeoisie, to describe the milieu. Are you an UB?
Yes. I had a very lucky childhood. My parents were in the preppy class, but they were progressives in the preppy class. They sort of met through liberal democratic politics. And so at that period, there weren't that many from that milieu that were liberal Democrats. And particularly in the city of Philadelphia, where my mother came from, they were particularly few and far between. And so they fell in love during the war. My father was dating two women he had met in Philadelphia, and my mother, he kept track of who wrote him the most letters, and my mother wrote him the most letters. And she also had the most lineage in the Philadelphia Bulletin in that period because she had a Society Notes column that she did with the help of her mother while she was also working in a bazooka factory. And so there was sort of a writing, an epistolary connection to my parents' marriage.
And your father, I believe, knew JFK.
He was in Kennedy's class at Harvard. They were in the class of 1940 together. Kennedy was slightly older because he had started at Princeton and then gotten sick. And he liked Kennedy. I don't think he was very close to him particularly. But in Democratic politics, he aligned with Kennedy and helped run his campaign in part of New York State. And was very active in that campaign. And earlier he had been in the Truman administration, and when Kennedy was elected, he went back into the administration.
I think it's true to say that your godfather was the sociologist behind the term WASP.
Yes.
So what was it like growing up in this sort of ultra sort of WASP milieu? I mean, what's it like to be a child in that sort of context?
Well, my parents are sort of skeptics to all that. And so they'd rather be sneering at that world. And so it kind of actually gave me the space to be the family rebel in embracing what they sneered at, because they would sneer at Republicans, people who played golf, people who played bridge, all these things. And yet, at the same time, my mother seemed to take great care that I was on the track to be invited to debutante parties. So it was this sort of socialist, but we're also going to make sure you get invited to debutante parties.